Using the wrong controller settings can be the difference between dropping high kill games or getting slammed. And you can't just copy someone else's settings because everyone uses different controllers and has different playstyles. So today, I'm going to share with you step by step exactly how I adjust my sensitivity, and I'm also going to show you my controller settings which allow me to get more kills. Now before we get into the settings, you have to know that there's one aiming skill that separates the great players from everyone else. This skill is really important because it allows you to get the critical first shots in a gunfight, and it gives you a higher probability of getting the kill. And this aiming skill is your centering, or your crosshair placement. If you watch any good player play, they have complete control over their crosshair, and they move it back and forth between areas of the map where they think an enemy will appear. And this is actually more difficult than it seems because you don't get aim assists when there aren't any enemies around. So in other words, you need to have complete control over your crosshair without any aim assists. And that's why I use my centering to find my controller sensitivity. First, I stand 10 to 15 meters away from a wall with two targets next to one another, and I bounce my crosshair back and forth between each target. Now my speed really isn't that important. What I'm looking at is how accurate I am and if I'm overshooting or undershooting the targets. Now I'm doing this in multiplayer in a custom map, but there are a lot of buildings and plunders with windows very similar to this. So while I'm doing this, I'm adjusting my sensitivity until I get something that feels right, and I'm giving myself about a minute or so at each sense. And I just adjust up and down based on how accurate I am. The general rule of thumb is you want to play at the highest sensitivity you can without sacrificing aiming control or consistency. The higher your sensitivity, the more difficult it is to control. Also, I repeat this step in the vertical direction. I just find two targets that are stacked on top of one another, and then I repeat what I was doing before. Now, I always use the same horizontal and vertical stick sensitivities, but there are some people out there who don't. So it's up to you on what you use. Now, after I find a sense that feels good, I put my back to the wall, and then I practice doing 180s and centering to one of the targets. There's gonna be a lot of times in Warzone where I'm getting shot in the back, and I have to turn around really quickly, so I want a sensitivity that's fast enough to do that. And just to be clear, I never expect to have perfect accuracy when I'm doing these tests. I'm just looking for the max sensitivity that I can use where my aim doesn't completely fall apart and start to get wild. This is pretty subjective, but if I can be within a couple meters of each target most of the time, then I feel pretty good about the sensitivity. And then after spending 5 or 10 minutes doing these tests, I then go on to something that I call follow the bot. I load into a custom game with some bots, or I hop into Plunder, and I just follow my teammates around while trying to keep my crosshair centered at their chest. I think this is a great drill for practicing your centering because it helps you visualize the player models as they move around the map, but it's also good for dialing in the right sensitivity. This step really gives me a good idea for how much control I have over my crosshair because I have to track a moving target without any aim assist, which is pretty hard. And one thing to know is that the closer they are, the harder it is to track. So I generally like to stay pretty close to my targets and make it as difficult as possible. And then once I've found a comfortable sensitivity, I move on to finding my ADS multiplier. This is the coefficient that slows down or speeds up your sensitivity when you're ADS on an opponent. Now this is a little bit trickier to find in my opinion, but what I like to do is similar to the last step, and I just follow my teammates around and I try to track them. And just like before, I adjust the multiplier until my aim feels comfortable and consistent. In a normal situation, you're gonna have aim assist on your opponent, so just keep that in mind because this is gonna be pretty hard. Now, if you don't have any teammates to track, or this is too difficult for you, one alternative that I've found that works pretty well is to hop into Plunder and stand on the train that moves around the big map, and then randomly pick targets to track as they pass by. So instead of tracking a moving teammate, you're the one that's moving on the train, and you're just tracking static targets. Now it's up to you how long you spend on each step, but after I've done all this testing, I like to get into a lot of gunfights to make sure my sensitivity and settings feel right in an actual game. Ideally, I like to test them out at close ranges and long ranges to make sure that I'm ready for any scenario that I find myself in. Now, ideally, it's good to do this whole process a couple of days in a row because your aim, just like any other skill, can vary from day to day. So by doing this for a couple of days, you should get a pretty good average of what settings feel right. And now here comes the hard part. I highly recommend locking in these settings once you've found them. You have to trust that all this testing did its job, and now you need to forget it and focus on improving in the game. No one talks about it, but the perfect settings don't actually exist. If you're a great player, you can be very successful on almost any sensitivity. I actually tested this out for myself back on Rebirth Island. At the time, I was playing on 7.7, but I switched to 2020 for a couple of games, and after I got used to it, I started to play pretty well, and I even almost got a 20 kill win. The point is, once you've found a comfortable sensitivity, you just need to spend the time aim training and developing the fine motor skills in your hand for better accuracy and consistency. If you switch your sense too much early on, you make it so much harder to develop good hand-eye coordination and good muscle memory. But the good news is, from what I've found, once you put the time in and master your aim at one sensitivity, you can easily change it down the road and still be really successful. I currently play on A8 with a 0.85 multiplier, but that could certainly change in a couple of months. So don't stress out too much about what you're starting at now. Just pick something that's comfortable and consistent. And for complete beginners to Call of Duty, I would just recommend using 5.5 or 6.6 at a 1.0 multiplier and put a few months into playing the game before you follow these steps. Okay, so moving on to dead zones. These are the settings that specify how much you have to move your thumbsticks or your triggers before the game registers an input. You definitely want the left and right stick values to be set to 99, but where you put the minimums comes down to your controller. For the triggers, you just want to set this as low as possible so that the game isn't registering any false inputs without you pressing the buttons. And for the sticks, if you've ever used a controller, I'm sure you know that stick drift is a huge design flaw. The conventional wisdom is to stand still and up the minimum dead zone until you no longer get stick drift. But I actually don't like doing this. I set my dead zones to the minimum value of 0 because I want my controller to register an input as soon as I move the thumbstick. This gives me the most amount of control over my aim. And I'm okay with a little bit of stick drift to get this control. Now, if you put this to the minimum value and your stick drift gets crazy, it's probably time to get a new controller. And if you're in the market to buy one, I've been using Hyper controllers for nearly 2 years now. I highly recommend them because they have great customization options and they're more affordable compared to other companies offering similar builds. I personally have to have a controller with 4 back buttons, and they have to be spaced far enough apart to use my middle and ring fingers while I'm playing. This gives me the most flexibility when I'm mapping my controller buttons, and it also allows me to do multiple actions at the same time. On my controller, I also have quick triggers and bumpers because this gives you the quickest reaction time when pressing these buttons compared to a stock controller. If you're interested in checking out Hyper controllers, you can use code DREAMSTRIKE for 5% off your order. Okay, so moving on to my controller layout. This is going to be extremely subjective because what works for me might not work for you, but by explaining why I've mapped my controller this way, hopefully it can help you decide what to do with your setup. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, my layout is going to be based off of my normal grip style. A lot of players do play claw like this, and the benefit to doing that, because now I have access to these buttons on the left and on the right, and I can just press them with the sides of my fingers. I don't find this grip very comfortable, even though a lot of pro players do use it. So that's why I opt to have a controller with back buttons. And the first thing to set up with your controller layout, in my opinion, is always your ADS and fire button, because obviously this is a first-person shooter game and we got to be able to kill people. So I have mine set up to ADS on L1 and then fire on R1. Now, as I mentioned earlier, my controller does have the digital or the quick triggers and bumpers. So the travel distance on the buttons is as small as possible. And the reason that I have this set up on R1 and L1 is because when I used to use stock controllers, if you look at the bumpers versus the triggers, the bumpers do have less travel than the triggers themselves. So if you are on a stock controller, you can put your ADS and fire buttons on these top two bumpers, and you should get a little bit more responsiveness out of the game when you're in a gunfight. And moving on from that, the next two most important buttons to set up, in my opinion, are your jump button and then your crouch and slide button. Because now that this game has brought back movement, it's really important to be able to maneuver around in gunfights and still be able to aim your gun. And kind of the golden rule for setting up your controller layout is that you want to take your thumbs off the analog sticks as little as possible. Because so if I move my left thumb off the analog stick, I can no longer move forward or move in any direction, and I'm just a sitting duck. And vice versa, if I move my right thumb off the analog stick, well, now I can't aim, right? So if I'm using the standard default controls here and I want to go jump in a gunfight, well, now I have to take my thumb off the analog stick and I can't even aim. So that's why I have these actions set up to my back buttons. I have crouch here and then jump on this side. And like I said, this is just to help me maneuver around in gunfights and be harder to hit and track. And then the next button that I set up is the interact button, because in Warzone, and especially with looting, you are constantly picking up things off the ground and, opening and closing doors. So I like to have my interact button very easy to access. So I have my interact button, which is also my reload button, set up to this button right here. And then from there, things get a little bit interesting with my layout. So one of the most broken things in this game, in my opinion, is live pinging opponents. So I have my last back button assigned to my ping button, because if you live ping someone in a gunfight, you basically do get walls on them and you can see exactly where they're going. So I like to be able to ping people during gunfights very easily, which is why I have that button set up that way. And this does give me a little bit of a problem though, because another thing that's really important in a gunfight is to be able to swap weapons. So for instance, if I run out of ammo in this gun here, well, I want to be able to swap to this gun to carry on in the gunfight. And that's why I have my weapon swap set up to L2. And I think L2 works well for this because you can't ADS your gun in the middle of a weapon swap. So I can move my left index finger back and forth between these two buttons fast enough to swap my weapons and then get back to pressing my ADS button before the game even allows me to do so. Which means there isn't any penalty to moving this finger. It definitely takes a little bit getting used to that, because I did used to have weapon swap on one of my back buttons, but like I said, I think live pinging is more important in gunfights. And then from there, for my L3 and R3 buttons, I just have L3 set up to sprint so I can easily snake, back and forth in gunfights. And then I have my R3 button set up to melee, and we all know that meleeing is pretty overpowered in this game. So I can do both these things very easily without taking my thumbs off the analog sticks. And then from there, a skill gap in this game that I think is important to get really good at is your inventory management. So I have my backpack set up on this top directional key here, and I do it for a very specific reason. I mentioned earlier that I don't like playing claw, but I actually do switch to a partial claw grip so that I can access my backpack. Because you can see that while I'm running here, I can quickly navigate around my backpack and, drop things and, basically do whatever I need to do in my inventory. And I still have complete mobility of my character. And this is definitely a skill that I think everyone should have. Even if you're not playing claw normally in the game, being able to switch back and forth, I think gives you just so much more flexibility with your mapping buttons. And then my right directional pad is set up to my kill streak button because it's pretty easy for me to click as well. When I switch to this partial grip. The bottom button is set to my tactical button, And then my left button here is set up to do my weapon inspect and then also switch my firing mode. I know some of you might be thinking, well, having your tactical button on the bottom directional button isn't ideal because, I have to take my thumb off my analog stick to, for instance, throw a smoke grenade or use a stim. And I would completely agree with you. And that's why the last two buttons that I have mapped are actually keyboard buttons. So there's a variety of different softwares and things you can do to map keyboard buttons to your controller. And I actually have the left part of this touchpad set up to be my tactical button. And then I have the right side of the tactical pad set up to be my dive button. And I know some of you might be shaking your head about, doing this, but if you go into the button layout page, Call of Duty says right here that during gameplay, all inputs unrelated to aim can be used from any device. So it's perfectly legal and fine to do this. Like I said, there's a variety of ways to accomplish this. If you're playing on Steam, you can go into the Steam layout and you can actually assign keyboard buttons that way. Depending on the controller that you're using, a lot of them have software now through the controller where you can assign keyboard buttons. And then you can also do what I'm doing, which is just using DS4 to assign keyboard buttons to your controller. Now, obviously this isn't ideal and I don't like having to do this, but it is just a weird thing that unfortunately the developers haven't addressed, which is that they don't give enough flexibility to controller players for mapping these buttons. So at least right now, we do have to use third-party software to accomplish it. And these are the rest of my controller settings. I think I've covered everything on this page. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm playing on 8.8 with a 0.85 multiplier. I'm not using any custom settings here, so these advanced settings I don't think actually do anything. They're just set to 1. My sensitivity multiplier is just default, I believe. The vertical aim axis is default as well. I don't use tack stance, but I have it set on 0.8. For my aim response curve type, I use dynamic, but I think all three are fine and it just comes down to personal preference. But when I'm using dynamic, my aim just feels a lot more responsive in gunfights and I just personally like it. For the aim response curve slope, I'm just using 1 so I get the full effectiveness of dynamic. And then these next couple of settings are just default. I don't use any custom zoom settings, so I have that turned off. Obviously you want to use aim assist, so I have it turned on. For the aim assist type, I think using default or black ops is pretty much the same, so I just have it on black ops. And then these last couple settings are just default. On the gameplay tab, I use automatic tack sprint because I don't like to have to press an extra button on my controller to go into a tactical sprint. So that's why it's on. I have slide maintain sprint turned on so that I can sprint out of a slide cancel. Auto move forward is turned off. Tactical sprint behavior is, I don't think it matters because I'm using auto tack sprint, but I just have it on single tap to run. These next three mansling settings, I think it's really important to have them all turned off because you don't want the game to do actions for you. You typically want to have full control of your character. And if you have these turned on, your character will accidentally mantle over objects when you don't want them to. And you can definitely get killed in gunfights that way. For slide dive behavior, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but I like using slide only because if you have this set on tap to slide, there's a slight delay from when you press your button to slide and when you actually go into the slide because the game is waiting to see if you're going to hold the button down to dive. I think the developers are working on a fix for this. But that's why I use slide only because there's no delay. And then I just use my touchpad to dive. Now, if you can't set up keyboard buttons to your controller, I do recommend putting it on tap to slide, especially if you're playing Warzone, because I do think that diving is pretty important in Warzone. Plunging underwater behavior, I have set on free. Definitely want to make sure your parachute auto deploy is turned off so that you can drop off buildings and not have your parachute deploy. You want to have your sprinting door bash turned on so you can run through doors that are closed. Ledge climb behavior is just on mantle only. These next couple of settings are just default, I believe. Like I mentioned, I do have my tactical stance turned off because I just never use it. And then for the interact reload behavior, I have it set on prioritizing interact. Once again, both these actions are tied to one button. So I think it's more important to prioritize the interact so that you can loot and pick up items off the ground very quickly. But you do have to be careful because if you do go to reload and there's something there on the ground, your character is going to pick it up instead of reloading. So just keep that in mind. For armor plate behavior, I have it on apply all, so that when I just hold down my L2 button, it just applies all the armor plates. This ADS stick swap is turned off. Backpack control, I like using the directional buttons because like I mentioned earlier, I do switch to a partial claw grip, and then this allows me to just navigate through this backpack. But if you don't want to do that, you can put this on stick. Depleted ammo weapon switch, I have it turned off. Once again, I just want to be in control over what my character is doing. Quick C4 detonation, I have it on group, so you can throw multiple C4 and detonate them all at one time. Manual fire behavior is just on press. And then here are my vehicle behaviors. And then lastly, these are my overlay behaviors. And if you want to see how to use these settings to break your opponent's ankles in Warzone, you should check out this video right here. Thanks, and see you in the next one.